name is Alison Morse. I am the Provincial Coordinator for Special Education with Easter Seals Ontario. And I'm very, very excited that we've been able to pull this conference together. Easter Seals Ontario has had pro-grants in the past, and pro-grant is from the Ministry of Education Parent Engagement Office. So they give grants to organizations that can facilitate and promote parent engagement in education. So for this grant, we had the idea of having a conference, and so we approached a couple of partners. So the two main partners that we have for this conference today is the Children's Treatment Network of York Simcoe region, and there's Michelle in the room. So right at the back there, Michelle Byler has been my my contact and liaison, and she's a member of the conference organizing committee. In addition, we partnered with 3-2B Foundation, and Brenda Agnew, who I can't spot, oh, she's way at the back, waving her arms, is the representative from 3-2B Foundation and also a member of our conference committee. So we put together a proposal, and we were very pleased to get about half the funding that we had asked for, but more than enough to pull off today, so we're very, very excited about that. In terms of the conference planning committee, I'd also like to identify Sherry Caldwell. Yep, up here at the front, and she was our fourth key member representing the CTN Family Advisory Committee. And then we have Tina Shire, who is my director at Easter Seals Ontario, and she was in charge of the registration deck. So in terms of, she is my supervisor, but for this event she has been a really awesome co-worker and has been doing a lot of the logistical details in terms of registrations. All went through Tina, and she's been out there on that table. She's also taking the lead for our food. The other thing that I would like to mention is that the pro-grant does have restrictions on how much money you can spend on refreshments, and we wanted to be able to feed you both when you arrived and at breaks and at lunchtime. So we were very pleased to get additional funding from the 3-2B Foundation and from Wolf Educational Services that has supported some of the food costs here today. So if I could provide an overview of the day, I'm welcoming you here in the theater, and our first presenter, Louise Sirisko, is going to give you an overview of what's happening at the Ministry of Education. There will then be a short break, and then there will be 4 sessions, and hopefully you've all got your personal agendas. The sessions that are being held in the theater are going to be recorded and live webcast today. So following on from Louise, we have Lynn Zeraldo in this room. This afternoon we have Joe Travato, and at the end of the day, I'm the speaker in this room. In the meeting rooms 1, 2, and 3, we have different presentations. We are also recording 2 of the sessions in meeting room 1, the presentation on accessibility by David Leposki and the presentation by the CTN York School Board staff on augmentative and alternative communication. So I wanted to let you know that those sessions are being recorded. What we're going to see online will be mostly the backs of your heads. But if you stand up to make a question, for example, you will be seen. So I just wanted to alert you to that as we go through the day. I have 2 final introductions that I'd like to make. I'm going to ask Carol Lloyd to stand up. Carol Lloyd is the CEO of Easter Seals Ontario, and I'm very glad that she was able to come and join us this morning. It's actually a very busy weekend for Easter Seals because we have our telethon, which is a major fundraising event, being held tomorrow. So I very much appreciate her taking time to come today. David Leposki is in the front row here. I'm going to identify him as the gentleman with the cane as he raises it over his head. David is the chair of the Accessibility for Ontarians with Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities, AOD, Act Alliance. I was trying to get what all the A's were. The AODA Alliance Chair. And so David has said that he would welcome any discussion with you throughout the day. He is presenting this afternoon, but if you want to collar him during the breaks, he's very happy to talk to you. And David has also recently become the chair of the Special Education Advisory Committee for the Toronto District School Board. So that's a fairly key position. So there is, as you know, a lunchtime networking session on SEAC, so David will be at that. But he wanted you to know those things up front so that he's prepared to talk with you anytime today. And we thank David for that. So, with no more ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker. Louise Sirisko has come to us from the Ministry of Education. Louise is actually new to her position. She was previously a superintendent with the Peel District School Board. So I think she's still in a bit of a learning mode. I don't know how many of these parent conferences you've done, but we're very, very pleased you would come today. Louise's title is as the Director of the Special Education Policy and Programs Branch. And so when I've done conferences in the past, I've always approached the director with the hope that they would come. And I have to say that Easter Seals has been very fortunate that we've had 3 of the past directors of the Special Education Policy and Program Branch come to speak at our conferences. And so that's like hearing about special education from the very top. So we really appreciate Louise coming out. So if you'd like to come forward, Louise.
Good morning, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here today, and although I'm new to speaking to a parent audience as the title of director, please be assured that I've met with many parent groups over my course of leadership years. So previously, I was a superintendent of special education with the Peel District School Board, and I had that position for 4 years, and previous to that, I was a superintendent of schools, which meant that I was responsible for 25 schools in the Peel region. I think what's most important about who I am is that I'm a mom. I'm a mom of 2 children. I have 2 typical children. My son is about to turn 20 and he's in university, and my daughter is just graduating from grade 12. So you can imagine empty nest syndrome happening for me, the worry of transitions. And before I was a mom, I was a teacher. I started my career teaching grade 4, grade 2, spent most of my educational years teaching intermediate students, and they were always my favorite because although they're 6'1" and 5'8", they're little children inside who need TLC just like a grade 1 student. But for my very first year of teaching, I was very fortunate to be supporting students in the mainstream who had exceptionalities, and I can remember their names, I can remember their exceptionalities, I remember meeting with their parents and talking about the hopes and dreams for their children and my role as an educator to make sure that they got there. So meeting with parents is a foundational piece of any educator role. So it is a sincere pleasure to be continuing that relationship as the director at the ministry. I have a slide deck this morning for us that's quite broad in its topics. I'm going to be giving you basically Special Education 101 from the Ministry of Education. We're a small, nice, intimate group this morning. I think it would be great if, as I am talking about a slide, if you wanted to go a little bit deeper or had a question, why don't we make this a little bit interactive rather than me going through the whole slide deck and then having questions or missing a question that was really important, near and dear to your heart. So what else can I say about our time together this morning? This is your opportunity to talk to the Ministry of Education. We are dedicated and committed to making sure that our outcomes for students with special education needs is exceptional. It's excellent. That doesn't mean to say that we get it right all the time. Having parents engage with us in our journey is a foundational part of being excellent and achieving excellence, which of course is our guidepost for the Ministry of Education. So without your feedback and input, we're not going to be able to reach that realization. So having your feedback is very, very welcome, and I want you to feel the opportunity very sincerely to communicate with me this morning so I can take away your feedback and take it to our policy advisors and our team behind the scenes. So does that sound good? Does that sound like it's going to meet our needs this morning? Okay, so let's get started. I need you to know I gave Allison just a heart attack this morning because we were scheduled, of course, to start at 9:30, and at that time I was booting it down from Newmarket, because don't you know there's a Dufferin Street in Newmarket. So I had a great tour of this beautiful countryside. Glad to be here. So I talked about achieving excellence. The cornerstone of the Ministry of Education is founded in a renewed document called Achieving Excellence, and you can get this on the ministry website. But the goals for education, and this was after deep consultation with all of our stakeholders, were basically 4 main goals within this this document, this vision document. Achieving excellence, and we determine that through typical measures of success like EQAO, and that can be a whole other topic about how we measure success for students with special education needs. I think that we need to talk about that more as a province. Ensuring equity, and that's really where your children, my students, fit into the equation. How do our students with disabilities or our students with non-identified learning needs meet excellence in that vision? How do students who self-identify as Aboriginal, students with English language learning needs, so there's a whole component dedicated to the success of our students who need to be looking at their pathway from an equity lens. Promoting well-being, and that's where mental health and well-being come into the consideration, and enhancing public confidence. And that's where we need to be doing an excellent job at engaging our parents, making sure that we are being transparent in the work that we're doing, and always having that interaction between what do we think we're doing, what do our stakeholders say that we need to do better, and embracing that feedback to move forward. Undoubtedly, you've heard from the Minister of Education this week, Liz Sandals, that we have a renewed math strategy announced in the province. I'm going to touch a little bit about that now and put it in the realm of special education and why I'm so excited to be talking about math. So our renewed math strategy announced this week is different. It's different from other strategies that we've done in the province previously, and that's because we have taken a really close look at the research that has gone before today and tried to develop a strategy that is deeply embedding the research of what we know has worked. So, for example, we know that there's something called an OFIP strategy that was supported from our Student Achievement Division, where schools that were not performing as well as we had liked to have hoped based on their EQAO data had direct support from ministry personnel. It was a co-leadership, hand-in-hand method of really diving deeply into student profiles and making sure that we were putting everything in place possible to make sure that students were successful. Our renewed math strategy has taken that concept and applied it across the province. In particular, we've looked at math scores from EQAO for grades 3 and grade 6, but we've been very, very intentional and said that we're asking schools to be paying particular attention for students with special education needs. So there are identified schools and boards within the strategy that are going to be having that tight connection that I talked about from our previous work with OFIP schools. But the team is going to be supporting frontline staff in saying, let's talk about who your special education students are, what are their IEPs asking us to do, and what is their profile, and let's make sure all of their instructional strategies are really tightly aligned to meeting with success. We're going to be increasing, again, based on what we know our students and our parents are asking us to do, some strategies to support you in supporting students. So there's homework help that's going to be augmented, and that is also available as a French resource. And for the first time, we're announcing and asking schools to be dedicating and protecting 60 minutes daily for mathematical instruction and learning. So that is a very significant change for our curriculum delivery as well as learning opportunities for students with math. We are going to be providing up to 3 lead math teachers for selected schools. And again, that is for recognizing that we need to be helping our teachers understand the math curriculum and to be taking the time to be learning about instructional strategies, particularly for students with special education needs. Also part of the strategy is coaching for principals in secondary schools. We're paying particular attention to students enrolled in applied mathematics. And incidentally, students who we know who are taking applied mathematics, a large majority of those students have special education needs. So we think that being very, very intentional at that course selection pathway will be really a help to deepening instruction and learning. As well, we are dedicating a PA day for teachers to dive deeply into mathematical instruction. So within the branch, so the Ministry of Education is made up of a number of branches. Special education is one, curriculum is another, student achievement, equity, parent engagement. So all of these branches have unique goals within them. So I just wanted to share with you today our goals within the special education branch. So, of course, we're dedicated to improving achievement and well-being. We're focused on increasing the capacity of schools. So that would be opportunities to have professional learning communities, partners coming out to be talking about instruction and learning, talking about profiles of students and how they differ. Supporting the development of IEPs, and we're going to talk a little bit about IEPs later in our morning time together. Enhancing collaboration among ministries, and this is a really important goal, and I'll be talking later this morning about what are the opportunities to be partnering with other ministries. The special needs strategy is an example, and we'll talk more about that, but that's a very concrete goal that the branch has. Improving the balance between teaching and learning, and process and documentation, so we're going to talk about the IPRC process as well as IEP development, and focusing on transitions. And we know that that is a really critical time in a student's life, both small T transitions and big T transitions, whether a student is changing from the elementary to the secondary panel or needing support in walking down the hallway because they're having difficulty with noise and navigating crowds. So let's talk a little bit about who are our students with special education needs in the province. So we talk about students with special education needs broadly in 2 categories, whether students are identified or not identified. I'm just going to move this. So if a student is an identified student, they have been formally assessed and taken to something called an IPRC, or an Identification, Placement and Review Committee. And that committee, who's made up of paraprofessionals and members of the school team, have reviewed the students. Usually it is a psychoeducational assessment, and they have said that that student is exceptional based on the Education Act, and they have categorized that student. So that's that group of students. We also have a large number of students who are what we call non-identified. So they may not have gone through an IPRC process, but the school has nonetheless said that this student is requiring support. Most likely they have created an IEP to support that student, and they have registered that student in a tracking system as a non-identified student. What the law says is that no matter what, when a school team is noticing that a student is struggling, we need to step up and make sure that that student has the supports and services that they require to be successful. A student does not need to have an identification based from an IPRC. They do not need to have that to have an IEP generated to have the supports and services. They don't need to have that identification to be sure that they are given provision for the supports and services that they're required. So statistically across the province, 55% of our students are formally identified and 45% are non-identified. Interestingly, 23,700 students are reported to neither be identified nor have an IEP. So that's a curious number that we're wanting to take a look at. We are encouraging boards to tell us a little bit about that. And if a student is reported as receiving services, why would a board not be choosing to have an IEP for that student? So we're on a quest to digging deeper in that data. So let's talk a little bit about the IPRC committee. So it's Identification, Placement, and Review Committee, and it stems from the Education Act and Regulation 181/98. So in our province, we are always asking for a student to be always beginning in the least restrictive, most enabling environment, and that means mainstream. So placed within a typical grade 2 classroom, as an example. And the legal language is that the IPRC must consider whether placement in a regular class with appropriate special education supports and services would meet those child's needs and is consistent with parental preference. So you would be representing a number of boards here this morning. What we know is that the conversation of inclusion is alive and well in the province, and different boards have different policies and outlooks in regards to inclusion. Some boards don't have contained class placements for students, and other boards believe that that's an important part of their depth and breadth of providing programs and services. Regardless of the model, parental preference needs to be taken into that consideration. So if an IPRC is suggesting that a student with physical needs be placed in a contained class environment because they think that that is going to be best aligned to their learning needs, what parents have to say really matters in the deliberation of the IPRC. And that's where the invitation for you to be present is very, very important, to be communicating and having a dialogue and a relationship with the school principal, and if there's a consultant or itinerant part of the school team is really important. And that you're also aware of what the programs and services your school board may offer for your child in their journey in education. I'm going to stop there, and are there any questions? Yes.
Opinions on that, saying that, if you're being supported with your IEP, you don't really need to worry about an IPRC, it's not necessary. How important is it going forward to have an IPRC?
Right. So the question, just for folks who are perhaps on the web or for later, how important is it to go to an IPRC? So let me back up a little bit and also say that every student needs to be having an annual review. And that technically is an IPRC, so how important is that student be taken to this committee? There are some boards in the province who IPRC very few of their students because it is the relationship with the school team and the parent is very strong, and that's where they want to be focusing their attention and focusing their energy and their resources. So I'm going to say that the quick answer to that question is, as long as you as a parent feel that that relationship is really strong, that you are feeling heard and are part of the team surrounding the program supports and services for your child, that's what you're after. An IPRC is really a mechanism that's grounded in legislation to enable that outcome to happen. And there are recourses for a parent to make sure that that aim of having that tight relationship is in place. So that's why the IPRC is there, but the intention behind the legislation is to get to the outcome of a team relationship very, very strongly bound. Does that answer your question? So if you've got it, that's great, and I would say I would agree with the school team that it's not necessary if you feel that you're part of the IEP, you know what the supports and services are available for your child. David.
You might just repeat the question in case the microphone doesn't pick it up for the webcast people. Under the regulations for an IPRC, the committee can make a decision over identification, does the child have an exceptionality, and over placement, but it cannot make a decision over what the regulations call programs or services. Doesn't define them. It says the committee can only make recommendations on program or services. And I'm just wondering if you could help the audience by letting us know if the Ministry of Education has given any direction to school boards or policy directions on what placement is as compared to what program or services are, because it's very important for an IPRC hearing for parents to know what they can get a decision on that's binding.
Perfect. Thanks, David, because you've given me a segue into my future slides.
Can you read the slides out, by the way, on this?
Oh, certainly. And I think I'm doing that, David,
That's great,
but I'll be sure to do that for you in particular and anyone else who would benefit from that. So David is wisely pointing out of the legislation of the IPRC and what it is responsible for doing and what school boards are responsible for doing. And he's zeroing in on the difference between identification and placement and programs and services. So let me, as we go through the slides, make that clarifying point really, really clear, and how when you're in a case conference with your child and the school team, what that means in the conversation elements.
So I can just ask one question as it pertains to the IPRC piece. So you spoke earlier about parental preference and how key that is, and really needs to be cognizant of that from an educational team perspective. So I guess I'm just a little bit challenged with, if you have that parental parent piece and it's strongly taken into consideration and that whole situation, where would you run into a problem with the parent disagreeing with an IPRC
Sure.
identification and needing to go through that whole
Sure.
process?
So what happens when it goes bang and when there's disagreement, and what are the steps to follow? So let me, just reading from the slide in the second bullet regarding IPRC, that it's in place as well as a conflict resolution mechanism that's very formalized. So in the first question that we have is, how important is the IPRC to have happen? If you've got a really positive relationship, everyone is seeing eye to eye, everyone is feeling informed, all systems go, away you go. But sometimes there are bumps along the way, and that's when the IPRC can be and is intended to be a pathway of conflict resolution and being sure that everyone is aware of what is available. So the bullet reads, parents who disagree with an IPRC identification and/or placement decision may appeal to the School Board Appeal Board, also affectionately known as a CAB, and thereafter to the Ontario Special Education Tribunal. So I'm going to talk about examples of where dispute happens and what that looks like and feels like, but let me first talk about David's question and the difference between identification, placement, and programs and services. So if I don't do a good job in answering those two questions, make sure that you put me on the hook afterwards, okay? So first of all, categories of exceptionality. So this is going to connect to identification. So the IPRC is talking about a student. They have lots of foundational information from the classroom, and perhaps that student has also been having a psychoeducational report done by a psychologist. And the IPRC committee, made up of a school social worker, a psychologist, the school principal, parents are invited to attend the meeting. They are going to be looking at broad categories of exceptionalities set out in the Education Act and as elaborated upon in a guide that we give to school boards called Special Education, a Guide for Educators. So they're designed to address a wide range of conditions that may affect a student's ability to learn and do not exclude any medical condition, whether diagnosed or not, that can lead to particular types of learning disabilities. But the really important point that I talked about earlier is that all students with demonstrable learning needs are entitled to appropriate accommodations in the form of special education programs and services. So there are 5 broad categories and then 12 definitions within those 5 categories. So we have behavior, intellectual, multiple, communication, and physical. And the categories were put in place as part of the enactment of Bill 82, which was passed in 1980 and fully enacted in all school boards in 1985. So within each of those broad categories become the definition. So an example is communication. So we have autism, deaf, hard of hearing, language impairment, speech impairment, learning disability. So we provide broad guideposts to school boards to consider that profile of a student, and the IPRC tries to do a match between that student profile and what the categories might be the best match in describing the needs of that child. So that is the identification element. So there are some students who have characteristics in their profile that might span more than one of those categories. And the IPRC is going to recognize that and list those as part of that student's profile. But we ask at the ministry that they consider their most significant or leading need as the main exceptionality. But remember that I was talking about that 45% of our students in the province are non-identified, so they don't have these descriptors associated with them. We just know that they have learning needs, and the school team are taking their reports and their achievement and everything that we know about them to make sure that we're aligning their instructional needs and accommodations and modifications to their instruction. So the ministry has a lot of advocates asking for a broadening of these categories. So, for example, fetal alcohol syndrome. There are advocates who would like us to see a category for fetal alcohol syndrome, or for Tourette syndrome, or for students who have attention deficit disorder. The Ministry of Education is saying that we think that these categories are sufficient, and what we've issued a memo to the sector, really what I articulated earlier, and that is we were very clear to say that the exceptionalities are designed to address a wide range of conditions that may affect a student's ability to learn. So when a medical condition like fetal alcohol syndrome or attention deficit disorder has an impact on the learning of that student, the categories that are here should be considered in connection with that medical condition. So as an example, a student with attention deficit disorder may, upon looking at that, the student's profile, fit the category of learning disabled. We're not necessarily going to be saying their exceptional or their identification is attention deficit disorder, but the impact on their learning is categorized as a learning disability. So, the determining factor for the provision of special education programs or services is not any specific diagnosed or undiagnosed medical condition, but rather the needs of the individual student on the individual assessment of the strengths and needs. And then I've just talked about and made the point that advocacy groups are asking us to broaden that. So why do we say no? There's a significant difference between a medical diagnosis and an educational identification. Our categories really try and talk about the impact on the educational identification. And as well as we would never be able to be fully inclusive of all the medical conditions that are out there. Yes? Right.
So can you maybe sort of explain why that would be?
I think historically, autism certainly is a medical diagnosis. I think at the time of the review, it also felt that the unique medical conditions for students with autism were unique and crossed over into educational needs as well. It also is a very fast-growing exceptionality, I would say. So it was considered a unique and disparate medical consideration. But absolutely, it's seemingly an inconsistency, and that is pointed out every time, certainly, from other advocates to say, well, if autism is up there, what about FASD? So making sure that we were being supportive of our advocates and making sure that we were meeting the needs of our students who have FASD and who have ADHD was to issue that memo to be saying that medical condition needs to be recognized, it needs to be talked about, we need to be providing professional learning and deep understanding with our teaching staff, all of our stakeholders who support that student, and being sure that we are looking at the categories that are there to best align. But again, let me go back to that first part of the consideration that there are many students who have autism, who have other conditions where the school teams together with the parent have said, let's keep this child as non-identified. It's about the supports that are in place for the student. Okay, so that's when an IPRC is having that conversation. Those are the categories and the identification elements that they have the ability to take a look at and say, okay, we're going to say this student is exceptional, and here's how we're going to describe them. Let me just diverge a little bit, and then we're going to talk about placements. So this graph on the screen, it's called an overview of demographics by exceptionality. And so again, we're only talking about that 55% of students in the province who we call identified, and all of the categories are there. So we see autism, behavior, blind, low vision, deaf, hard of hearing, developmental disability, gifted, language impaired, learning disability, MID, multiple, physical, and speech. What you see on this bar graph is that learning disability is by far and away the largest identified exceptionality that we have in the province, followed by gifted, followed by autism, then MID, multiple, and behavior. So what this graph is showing are varying rates. David?
Two questions, one of which is, do you have a category of other where people are identified but not within one of those classifications that were spelled out in regulations 18 years ago?
No, I would probably say, David, that they would fall under non-identified.
Okay, and the other question I have is, this assumes watertight compartments, and of course children don't like that. So there's a significant number of gifted students, I understand, who maybe may have learning disabilities. Do you have the breakdown that accommodates the fact of students having multiple conditions?
So David's question, just repeating for folks on the web, is how do we, students, none of us fit in one category completely. How do we capture students who have multiple exceptionalities? How do we describe that? So the answer is we don't have data that captures that. And I would say that describing the students across our province who have special education needs is it's a bit of a challenge, because already I have said that we have our identified and our non-identified. Even within the non-identified, students would have profiles that are similar to a learning disability, who may have a developmental disability. So I would say that describing our students is a challenge from a large bird's eye view. It really comes down to making sure that we're meeting your children's needs, comes down to a school level and that conversation. So that's my quick answer in the data description.
Yeah, just so I'm clear, so we can understand this. So when there's a figure up there for gifted, if a child is both gifted and has a learning disability, where are they? Do we see them on this chart as gifted or in learning disability, or could it be some are in one and some are in the other, and therefore neither number is really?
So what we ask school boards to do is to list the number one descriptor of the profile of that student. So if their prevailing need is giftedness, that would appear first, and that would be the data capture that we pull up. School boards have the potential to pull down students who are multiple categorized. I'm going to go to a question on the right.
Can you speak to why mental health is not represented?
So can I pause on that for a second, because we're going to talk about well-being, and that's a very interesting point. Why don't we have a categorization for mental health? But give me a second and let me talk a little bit about placement, and then we'll come back to that. So placement options. So students are identified accordingly, as I had talked about, and then the IPRC has an opportunity to be talking about placements, and the placement options that we have a range. So regular classroom with indirect support, regular classroom with resource assistance, regular classroom with withdrawal assistance, special education class with partial integration, and special education class full-time. So remember, I talked about the very first consideration of the IPRC is the least restrictive, most inclusive, right? So that's at that is regular classroom with indirect support. So it's a broad range of interventions and supports available. We always want to be starting with regular classroom with indirect support, and that means that the classroom teacher is going to be receiving the support perhaps from a resource teacher to be talking about the program available for that student. Resource assistance might be the consideration of an occupational therapist who's coming in. Withdrawal assistance might be that student has access to a special education resource at the school level, and they're going to be taken out 40 minutes 3 times a week to be working on their learning needs as identified. Partial integration, so special education class with partial integration. This is where we're moving up the intervention support for a student. So this would be saying, we think that child is going to benefit from a special education class, but we're going to be reverse integrating that student into a mainstream class. And then lastly, special education class, so that would be a contained class full-time. So that is the range. Now, there's lots in between that is able to be customized for a student, and that's where the conversation with the school team to talk about what your hopes are for a student, your child, and the goals that are connected to the IEP. Many times I've had conversations with parents who want to make sure that we are providing as much integration as possible for a child. So we might start with a special education class full-time in September, but we have goals and markers along the way that encourage integration to as much as possible into a mainstream class by the end of that year. So that's with continued conversation with all parties involved. Question over here.
That often schools wait for the child to be diagnosed before they offer special education services. And I wonder what your comment is on the need for diagnosis or an assessment by a psychologist, which is so hard to access before a child receives either special education supports from through an IEP or going to PRC.
Okay. And I want to loop back to David's question. So the question from a member of our audience, who's a pediatrician, talked about the pressure that parents are asking you to be having a diagnosis before eligible for a contained class and supports and services. It's for any special education supports. And is that particularly for autism? Or is it for anything?
No, I would say
for anything. Okay. And so I want to loop back also to David's first question about identification, placement, supports, and services. So let me loop back to David's question, make sure that I've rounded that answer out, and then we'll talk about how school boards operationalize this. So remember that IPRC, that formal team, and they are under regulation asking about identification, so the categories that we talked about, and placement, and here are the placement options. So remember that a parent is also part of that committee. The IPRC makes recommendations for programs and services. So the programs and services might be the range that the school board has to have at their discretion. So whether that is a withdrawal support or inclusion in a reading skills group and so on. Sometimes parents disagree with the identification and placement, and we see that, and that's where that disagreement can happen. So the question of what are some examples of conflict. Some parents don't want their child identified. Sometimes they don't want their child within a contained class, or sometimes they do want their child in a contained class. So the IPRC has to be really working collaboratively with the parent to be saying, here are the range of supports, and this is why we're recommending this. For a parent who is wanting a contained class, we really are looking at the needs of that student and whether that is aligned. It's more often that a parent does not want a contained class and perhaps a board is recommending, or the IPRC, is recommending that a contained class. So in that case, it's my experience that the IPRC and the board would say, we're not going to force a parent to be having their child placed in a contained class setting if they're not wanting that, and we're going to really be relying on the accommodations and modifications within that mainstream setting, and they're going to be talking about all of the supports and services that they can put in place for that child to be successful. If the conversation at the IPRC table or more broadly with a school board team does not resolve the issue, a parent can always appeal the decision of the IPRC, and that is a formal process called a special education appeal. And the board sets up a committee, parents have an advocate, and the school board has an advocate, and it's a more formal conflict resolution. If that does not resolve the issue, parents have the opportunity to appeal to a special education tribunal. We very, very rarely see that across the province because of the positive problem solving that happens. So that is the appeal process. So if I could talk a little bit about why are school boards asking for assessments to best why do school boards ask for assessments? And I would say that what school boards are wanting to do is to be sure that they have a very deep understanding of the child's profile. It is a very complex consideration. So for a student who school board is observing, noticing, and we are feeling that there needs to be partnership with our outside community partners, a school board is going to be encouraging a parent to pursue that avenue. And we consider our partnership with our pediatricians, with our psychologists, psychiatrists across the province to be very, very important, because we are saying there are some needs here that we need advice on programming for. So for a student with occupational therapy needs or with consideration of autism, we are asking our community partners to give us advice on that so that we can be best aligning the supports and services that we have. So it is very typical for school boards, particularly for students with autism, to be asking our pediatricians to give us guidance in regards to that so that we can be, again, aligning our programs and services. As well, school boards, particularly those who have contained classes, remember I talked about that continuum. Ideally, we always want to have mainstream placement, but many school boards have a small number of contained classes. They need to be, in our structure across the province, supporting the students with the highest level of need. So a school board is using an assessment to help understand who are our students with our highest level of need, and what is the recommendations from our partners to do that. So more and more often, what we're seeing happen in a very positive way is partnership with our community partners in case conferences to help uncover the profile of that child. And we're doing that with telepsychiatry as an example, where we are feeding in psychiatrists and pediatricians into team meetings to deeply understand that child's profile from a medical perspective and how it's interplaying with an educational need. So have I answered the questions that have been posed thus far? Okay, I want to carry on. Yeah, please.
I just wondered if you could just, when you talk about highest level of need, you know, is that, are we talking about medical, are we talking about physical, cognitive,
All of it.
behavioral?
How do we define greatest level of need?
Children who have a high level of physical disabilities does not dictate that they have a high level of cognitive disability.
Correct.
So if you put them into a contained classroom where they need to be in a regular classroom with withdrawal assistance, I think, you know, that's when we start to see these parents get into these locked horns as far
Right.
as IPRC conversations. I just wonder what that looks like when you refer to highest needs.
So great question. So this is really an interplay of all the questions we have had thus far. So a student with a physical disability, high cognitive ability, would we be recommending a contained class placement for that student? And how does that work? So let's go back to a foundational belief and ask from the Education Act, and that is a student be considered for a mainstream placement, regular class placement. We have a duty to be accommodating and modifying the program for that student. So I would suggest that that student with that profile would be best suited in a mainstream placement with the appropriate accommodations and modifications. And as a parent, you would be certainly advocating for that, I would imagine. Now, that doesn't mean to say that there aren't other programs and supports and services that that child would need, occupational therapy, physiotherapy, and so on, that would need to be part of it. And that's where that interplay and that partnership with our community partners to have a really robust plan for that child comes into place. I saw a question in the center. Yes.
It's not really a question, it's just a comment. And just to be perfectly clear, I think the biggest issue, specifically talking about physical disabilities with our school boards, inclusion costs money. And I think that's the biggest issue our school boards are facing right now, is to be effectively inclusive, have these kids be in a mainstream classroom, which is where I personally feel they belong. It costs money.
So-
and that's the barrier that most of the parents are stumbling up against.
So a comment from the audience that inclusion costs money and that she's feeling that that is the provision of finances is a barrier to achieve full inclusion. Did I get that right? Okay. So the inclusion, I'm not going to say it's a debate, the inclusion conversation is alive and well. And what I'm observing in my role as director is that every board is asking themselves, how can we deepen our inclusive practices within our school board and within our schools. And I want you to know that school boards are paying very, very good and excellent attention to where they are now and where they want to be. And we're on a continuum across the province. Even accessibility. We know that the AODA Act, as an example, has very, very high and solid expectations for us as time moves on as far as accessibility for members of our population who have physical challenges. Do we have curb cuts? Do we have elevators? And not all schools are physically accessible at this point. That is a reality. But school boards are aware of what schools are problematic, and they're chipping away at working on making sure that they're meeting the accessibility standards. Now, David, I would have been surprised if I did not see your hand raised.
I have to, because at the Toronto District School Board SEAC meeting a month ago, we had the senior facilities official advised us that of the 550 schools in Toronto's public school system, only 85 are accessible on their standards. I'm not saying they're...
Not your standards, their standards.
Their standards. Moreover, they said that they get no money, and I'm not vouching for the accuracy of anything we're told, nor am I disputing it. I'm just telling you what we were told at an open meeting. from a senior official, this is important, they said they get 0 from you in the ministry for any targeted retrofits, that they have to find that money within whatever they get for capital anyway. They said that they cobbled together 5 million this year on their own and will be able to fix, they're hoping to get the number up from 85 to 140. They also said that they have no provincial standard for when they are building a new school for ensuring it's accessible. All that there is out there is the building code, which anyone who knows anything about accessibility is woefully inadequate. So there's no provincial guidance. Each school board must reinvent the wheel, and if to use your words, they are chipping away at it. They're chipping away without any budget or direction or standards to guide them.
So I can always, David, I appreciate that feedback and those comments. I'm not, so what you'll, I hope appreciate about me is that if I am not having the information to respond, I'm going to say that. So I'm not the finance branch. I can attest that certainly the special education policy and program branch do not fund school boards for ensuring accessibility. What I can share with you is my knowledge that there are school boards who, out of their operational budget, absolutely dedicate funds from their facility renewal amounts to continue to improve their accessibility standards. So, David, I will take that back and talk to the finance branch to be asking that question and to be advocating as well on your behalf. Certainly, what I know in my work as a special education superintendent is that the Accessibility Act provided standards for us to which we were measuring our schools. I know that boards of education have taken an inventory, just like Toronto District School Board has by your account, of where they are and how are we describing our schools and how can we be bettering our schools in a systematic way moving forward. It's going to take time. Okay, so we have 5 minutes. I'm going to skim and scan my slides to say what is really critical before we leave. But while I'm doing that, question from the audience. Go ahead.
In regards to the vision of education, you said for enhancing public confidence. In regards to the I've been part of the special needs strategy, and a lot of the comments were that for the containment classes, a lot of the teachers kind of just babysit the children and are not really have the knowledge of what to do with the children. What types of programs and education are there for these special education community class teachers?
Could I ask a clarifying question? So the comment was made in concern regarding public confidence and a concern that a placement in a contained class or a special education class has very low level of support for children who are placed within that class. Could I ask about the source for that, or is that just...
Just kind of random talking to
Okay.
you. My daughter is in a containment class, and I have to say I've had an exceptional teacher throughout the system. But other parents that I've talked to don't have that experience.
Okay. So what she shared is that personally her child is in a contained class and has had excellent support and service and good growth for your child, but that there are other concerns that she hears that differ from that, and right? So I could say that we all need to be sharing the excellent stories that we have about what is happening for our children within Ontario schools. We have seen incredible achievement growth with our students with special education need as measured by EQAO is one example. But the story for you personally about the amazing teacher that you've had is the common story. It is the story. And when it's not the story, that's when parents need to advocate and partner with the school team to be making sure that your needs are being met. And why I ask you to be sharing those personal stories is so that that concern or that narrative, that friend of a friend comment can really be dispelled from the personal story that you bring to talk about our teachers and our educational assistants. There are lots of supports that we put in place for our teachers, our ECEs throughout the province, and through our school boards in their creation of program supports and services. And I can assure you that all boards, all teachers are dedicated to meeting the needs of our children and having successful outcomes. I'm going to take, I think, probably one more. Oh, thank you, yes. So mental health and well-being, and I have a slide here, so thank you for that. I should be hitting on that slide. We are going to be talking very shortly about a well-being strategy across the province, very much like our renewed math strategy. We're going to be talking about a well-being strategy. And what we're acknowledging in the province going back to that first slide of achieving excellence, that well-being for all of our students is foundational. For the school boards, what we are wanting to position is that we are in an excellent position to be making sure that our classrooms are providing and ensuring that there are programs and supports, curriculum that enable students to come to school and feel resilient, to feel well. And that includes staff well-being as well. That we need to be looking at physical health, cognitive, social, emotional, as well as self and spirit. We need at times to be partnering with our outside agencies for students who we're noticing and that we need to be connecting with our psychiatrists, pediatricians, because there are other mental health concerns that are being noticed and documented and need to be supported. For students whose profile is branching into that upper level of concern, I would typify that is a mental health concern, and where in our categories might we be describing that is what the IPRC would be considering. Might we be suggesting that student has behavioral needs because they're highly anxious, they're having an attendance concern, or perhaps there are other categories that would typify what we're seeing in a classroom. We might want to say, because listening to a parent for a child who has a diagnosis of an anxiety disorder, we don't want, says mom and dad, to be having the word behavior next to our child. So the school team might be saying, maybe it's better for us to be saying that your child is a non-identified child, and we're going to be putting in place some supports and services through the creation of an IEP and making sure that we're wrapping around your child with all that we have to provide. So having a category specifically for mental health is not a consideration that we're taking right now, but I can assure you that the supports and services are just as important for a child with an anxiety disorder, who might be schizophrenic, to a child who has a severe learning disability, and we would use the same consideration that we do for the identification and placement. So I think I'm out of time, but
You are, but is there anything else that you would like to share with the group? Because we cut you off a lot of your presentation.
yes, absolutely, I'll be sharing the PowerPoint. Great questions, and I hope I could have gone through all of the slide deck with you, but I think being responsive to the questions that you have, I'm hoping felt that it was a little bit more interactive, and I will leave the slide deck with Allison to be sure, so that you can be reading the other information. I would just want to leave you with that the Ministry of Education is deeply dedicated to your children. You are here today because you have a child or a family member who you are advocating for because that they have physical needs, or perhaps other needs that are part of your child's profile, and that we're here to support you. Your school board is there to support you, and your school team is deeply dedicated to making sure your child is successful. And have faith in that. Continue to partner. Continue to dedicate your time. Talk about who your child is and their profile, what they love to do on a weekend, what their needs are. You know them best, and never think that what you have to share with a school team is unimportant. It's all important, and we're here to receive it. Thank you.
I'd really like to thank you, because I think we could have gone on listening to you for probably another hour. Like, you could have been the whole day, because you have a wealth of information to share. And I feel really mean in terms of cutting you off, but I also know that we've got a lot of other good speakers that are going to go in depth into lots of other issues related to special education. We now have about a 10-minute break, which you can go out into the atrium to get some refreshments, and then to go to whatever room you're supposed to be in at 11 o'clock. But before you go, I really do want to thank Louise for coming out today. I'm sorry that you got lost.
It's okay. Beautiful neighborhood.
But it was great that you were able to get here, and I think I really appreciated the fact that you were so interactive with the audience, because that means it makes it more relevant when you're answering their questions. So thank you very much.
so welcome.
Thank you.